Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Elloian. Our guest today is Professor Carlton F.W. Larson. He is a Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law. Professor Larson has taught constitutional law and legal history since 2004, and he is the author of several books, including On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. His upcoming book will be on the Declaration of Independence to be released in 2026. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. Let's welcome Professor Larson. Welcome, Professor Larson.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, I read your book. It's fascinating. It is a compendium of information on treason, much of which I did not know. And it's written in a very compelling way for the average person to understand and comprehend. So let's start from the beginning. What is treason?
Well, basically, every country in the world has some type of treason law. Usually, the core idea is some betrayal of the state in some manner. The United States is distinctive because we actually wrote a definition of treason into our Constitution. It's the only crime defined in the Constitution. So Article 3, Section 3 says treason against the United States is limited to levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. So that's essentially it. Levying war against the United States is essentially the crime of internal rebellion, trying to overthrow the government internally. Aiding enemies is generally aiding foreign enemies who are at war with the United States. And that's it. Anything else, lots of bad things you can do that you might sort of colloquially say are traitorous or betray the country. If it doesn't meet that actual definition, it's not technically treason in the US.
So how are some of the events that are unfolding as we speak? How would those events be classified? Such as, would they be espionage? Some of the things that, some of the criminal acts we see unfolding in our government.
So espionage is an interesting case because espionage is essentially providing, government secrets to really any foreign entity, and it doesn't have to be an enemy. And so espionage is in many ways much broader than the crime of treason. And if you go back to the Rosenbergs in the 1950s, who were accused of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, they were tried not for espionage, not for treason, because technically we weren't at war with the Soviet Union. It was a Cold War, and cold was important, meaning that we weren't actually shooting at them. So they weren't technically an enemy under treason law. But everybody called the Rosenbergs traitors. And even the judge in that case referred to them as traitors, even though technically the actual crime was espionage, or even more formally, it was conspiracy to commit espionage. So that's often a crime that is sometimes at issue. When government just misbehaves in general, when the government does things that are unlawful, that could be a wide variety of crimes, but it's rarely going to be treason. To be treason, it would actually have to be levying war against the United States, essentially, an armed force against the government. The closest we've seen to that would have been January 6th.
Let's see. And as we know, January 6th, those insurrectionists were pardoned by the president. What do you think the framers of the Constitution had in mind with regards to events like January 6th?
Well, I think in the late 18th century understanding, something like January 6th would have probably been viewed as an act of levying war against the United States. At the time, assembling an armed force, marching on the Capitol, attempting to use force to change the government in some way, was seen as an act of levying war. And so I think under the late 18th century understanding, that would have fit pretty clearly in to what levying war against the United States was. Now, there's a good argument that the law has changed since then, and that later cases, particularly in the mid-19th century, emphasized that it had to be essentially an attempt to overthrow the government entirely, as opposed to, say, obstruct a particular law. And so it's possible the January 6th people might have benefited from a narrower reading of treason that you would see in the 19th century cases. And it's also noteworthy that the Justice Department did not pursue treason charges against any of the January 6th defendants.
Mhm. But the original drafters, they escaped a king. And I think they had something in mind that, to prevent that type of occurrence from happening again. Do you want to talk a little bit? I know you've also written about the Declaration of Independence. I know there's 27 items in there that actually 27 grievances that they have had about the king. And we see a lot of controversy now with the No Kings rallies and things of that nature. So do you want to talk about some of those grievances and how they fit into this whole paradigm?
Sure. So the Declaration of Independence lists all these things that the king and parliament had done that in the eyes of Americans essentially made them unfit to rule. And they repeatedly say that they had acted in unconstitutional manners, that they had violated the law. And this is very important because it's an argument in the Declaration of Independence that the king was bound by the law. Right? The king can't just do whatever he wants. He must comply with constitutional norms, with rules, established procedures. And one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence is that he has transported us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. And that actually links back to treason. It was the claim that the king sought to take American colonists to London and try them for treason. For doing what? For basically resisting the king's government in America. And there was a lot of concern that essentially resistance to the government would be painted as criminal treason. And so if you send those people to London, who's going to try them? Well, a jury in London and not a jury of their peers. And so the Declaration talks about deprivation of trial by jury as being an absolutely essential part of what the American colonists were entitled to. So you see this whole series of complaints about unlawful, inappropriate behavior, which is enough to justify overthrowing the government and establishing a new government that presumably will do a much better job of protecting the people's rights and liberties.
And some of those grievances that were listed in the Declaration of Independence include the item that you just cited, but also quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, as you said, transporting beyond seas. How about suspending our legislatures and declaring invaded with the power of the legislator in all cases, and domestic insurrections, inciting those among us? How do you see that parallel with today?
Well, so when the Declaration talks about suspending legislatures, that is at the absolute heart of what government should not be doing, because the Declaration refers to the word right. It refers to it in the very beginning. It talks about the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it mentions one other right in the document. And that right is the right of representation in the legislature. This was the foundation on which everything else rested, the right of the people to have a voice in their government through a representative assembly. Taxation without consent, the only way the consent was provided is through that representative assembly. So the people who say the Declaration is indifferent to the form of government, that's just simply not true. It really tells us that representative assemblies are critical. They are the ones who impose taxes, right? Not the king. The king cannot do it. Only Parliament can impose a tax. And when you look at the analogy here, you see, well, president imposing tariffs. What are tariffs? Tariffs are taxes. And so that raises a very serious concern if the president is empowered to do that. And that gets into the weeds of a lot of different statutes as to whether or not Congress has granted that power to the president or not. But there's a decent argument that certainly in the late 18th century, granting any taxation power to the king or the president would have been viewed as just fundamentally inconsistent with the basic idea that every tax requires consent from the representative assembly.
Mhm. And then we see the gerrymandering that's going on to further disenfranchise people from their representatives. How do you see that fit into the fundamental beginnings of this nation?
Yeah, so Well, in some ways, it's a little bit tricky because it does go way back. I mean, it's named for Elbridge Gerry, who was in Massachusetts in the early 19th century, created one of these really distorted sets of legislative districts. So it does have a long and ignoble history here in the country. But if you sort of think of it at a deeper level, when it's taken to the extreme, as it is in some places, where essentially, a majority in a state might not have a majority in the state legislature, or a majority that's only 52% ends up with 75% of the seats, that doesn't look like what representation is supposed to look like. Right? And so voters are supposed to pick their representatives instead of, in this case, representatives literally picking their own voters by drawing the districts. And we can see, as these things get pushed even more this year with mid-year redistricting, just how aggressive that can be. And I show my students computer simulations of how to do this. And it is impossible, right, almost to overcome that. You say, well, you just rally your side more, get more voters out there. The math just isn't there. If you've done a really good gerrymander, it is really, really, really hard. And the difference between, say, making every district in the country skewed Republican or every district skewed Democrat would be probably 250 seats in the House of Representatives would sway just on that alone. So it really, really, really matters who draws these lines. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately said there's nothing courts can do about it, nothing federal courts can do about it because there's no discernible standard. I think that was deeply unfortunate, as Justice Kagan said in her dissent, because clearly you can't count on the political process to do anything about it. People have tried to create the independent districting commissions. Some Democratic states have done that, but then that, as we've seen with Texas, just makes them vulnerable to similar things by red states. And so now California is putting on the ballot to try to change it and counter that. So it's an absolute mess. One interesting thing is that districts are not actually required by the Constitution. That is a federal statute. There's a decent argument that you should have just open elections across the whole state for all the districts. Geographic districting is a big part of the problem. One solution would be just to get rid of it, and that would eliminate the gerrymandering problem. Another solution is potentially, even though it sounds a little odd, is to increase the number of seats in the House of Representatives. And if you do that, it also, depending on how it's done, can make gerrymandering less of a problem. We have 435 seats in the House. It's been the same since the 1910s. Hasn't grown, even though our population has grown dramatically. Members of the House don't want to do that. This would just take a simple statute. You don't even need a constitutional amendment. A simple statute can expand the House of Representatives. Well, they're not too happy being 1 out of 435. They really want to be 1 out of 1,000, even though that probably would be better for the country in terms of bringing representatives closer to the people.
Yeah, so because Texas is right now, they're heavily involved in changing the dynamics of the state and their voters. And I know that California is trying to counter that. And there are other states that I believe are also getting on that tack. How do you see that ending? Do you think it will have a good ending, or you think it will come to fruition?
Well, no, and once this starts, there really is no good ending. I think each state will do it to the max it can. It's possible that if you do it too far, then the state risks that in a wave election they've actually opened up more seats than they intended to the other party. So there is a risk of that, that it could in some states actually kind of backfire on particular states. But once you go down that road, you are deep down that road, and once you've opened up mid-decade redistricting as a standard practice. This was very uncommon. I mean, Texas did it, I think, in 2003 or 2004, and that was, really criticized because you're supposed to do this every 10 years with a census, but Congress has never squarely said that. It was just understood. Now, if it becomes, not just say middle of every 10 years, but maybe 4 times every 10 years, maybe after every election, you can change the districts around. And here's where Congress really could step in. And I think there was a bipartisan call for this, both Republicans and Democratic representatives who said, let's just have a law that says it's every 10 years. Once you've done it for 10 years, that's it. We shouldn't be just reopening it up for gamesmanship. And I think that would make a lot of sense. I would love to see Congress make that reform.
Yeah, me too. I think it would put a lot of these issues to bed and help the process be legitimized as well. Now, I want to get back for a moment to your book on treason. Can a citizen of a state commit treason?
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting sort of arcane area of treason law. We always think of treason against the United States, and of course there's the federal definition in the Constitution, but most states have their own form of state treason law, where it's a crime to commit treason against the states. Right? You're in Massachusetts, you could, in theory, commit treason against Massachusetts. I'm in California, I could commit treason against California. And you say, well, that sounds really, really weird. What
Yeah.
could that possibly be? Right? Well, we actually have a few instances of it in history. So in Rhode Island in the 1840s, there was a big dispute as to what was the proper government of Rhode Island. There was an event called the Dorr Rebellion, where people argued that they were in fact the legitimate government of Rhode Island. That resulted in treason charges for treason against the state of Rhode Island. In 1859, John Brown led the raid on Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. What is now West Virginia, it was then Virginia. He was charged with treason against the state of Virginia and hanged for that crime, treason against Virginia, for levying war against Virginia in his raid. And then in West Virginia in the 1920s, there were people who were involved in serious disputes, coal miners, disputes with coal mines, which essentially led to open warfare. And they were charged with treason against the state of West Virginia. So it has been used. It's not very common. Some people say, and I think this makes sense, that it doesn't work for foreign enemies. That is, states don't have enemies. Only the United States has enemies. So a state can't prosecute someone for, say, aiding a foreign enemy. But I think they can prosecute people for sort of internal rebellion against the state. So that is, if you try to overthrow the Massachusetts government while maintaining loyalty to the United States, you haven't committed treason against the United States, but you have arguably committed treason against Massachusetts. Now, fortunately, those are unusual, very uncommon type situations, but it is a part of our law.
But how does that square with um, states having, well, the president sending National Guard from one state to another state? Does that have come into play, any of those issues at all?
Not really, because generally in the state treason context, you're talking about their own states, citizens of that state trying to overthrow that state's government. And so if that were to happen, you could see a situation where the state governor might say, we have a bad situation in our state, please help, and then the president would federalize um, the militia to help put that down. But
Yeah.
that would be a very unusual situation.
But we have the opposite of that happening now. So how would that be categorized, where we have Governor Pritzker of Illinois saying, I don't want federalized troops from Texas or California or wherever in my state? How does that square with some of these laws and, treason or invasion, or in your opinion?
So it really depends kind of on what exactly the president is doing. So there is authority in the federal government to call out basically the National Guard to enforce the laws of the Union. And so that was done, for example, in Arkansas in the 1950s, dealing with school segregation. And the governor there didn't want that. I mean, he famously stood on the schoolhouse steps and tried to prevent any of this from happening. So there is such a federal power. Now, predicate of that usually is that federal law is not being enforced. And so you would have to show that that is in fact the case. And then you get into a lot of debate as to what extent that assertion by the president that federal law is not being enforced, is that reviewable by a court? To what extent should a court defer to the president's determination? Those are, I think, fairly hard questions. And we're starting to see them now as district courts are confronting this. And it seems like the district courts, in many cases, are saying, look, this is just simply not a situation where the federalization is appropriate. Now, what the Supreme Court will do with that, who knows? But it's certainly a very disputed legal issue.
It's troubling from the standpoint that the president was actually looking at old footage in Oregon and saying, let's call out the troops when there was nothing happening in Oregon.
Yeah, and so part of the problem is, all of our law is generally, and particularly constitutional law with respect to the presidency, has assumed the president basically acting in good faith and on the basis of accurate information. And so you're willing to allow the president the occasional mistake if you assume that they basically are trying to do a good job. Well, what happens if you have a president who truly does not know what the actual facts are? And I think you're right. I think what happened here is the president was shown by his aides 5-year-old footage and told that that was happening right now. And he honestly believed that, honestly believed something that is just absolutely not true. And so, how should a court deal with that situation? That is not something that courts have had to deal with in the past, where the president thinks it's untrue, and you have a Justice Department that's willing to come in and say things that in many ways are largely untrue. Our system is always sort of depended on, again, people acting in good faith, understanding that people come from different political perspectives, but that it's not going to be based entirely on lies and self-interest and grifting. And unfortunately, there's just simply, way too much of that right now.
And one of the things I find troubling is referring to the enemy within. I mean, historically, I think that was the enemy within was probably the British people against the colonists and those that were, hiding their true allegiance. How do you see that square with current events? Do you think that terminology is appropriate or not?
No, it's not remotely appropriate. And you see, first of all, you see things like the president seeming to view people as owing loyalty to him personally. That is, not just the members of the executive branch or the military, but almost American citizens are supposed to somehow owe loyalty to Donald Trump. Well, that's not remotely true. Nobody owes loyalty to Donald Trump. We owe loyalty to the United States of America. We take an oath of allegiance to the United States of America, not to the president. And when the president refers to particular people as enemies, in treason law, that has a very distinct meaning. It means generally foreign people with whom the state is in a state of open war. In treason law, there's no such thing as an enemy within. You might have rebels or insurrectionists, but you don't have actual enemies. And when you start using that term, you're essentially importing the language of warfare to our fellow citizens. And so that you're saying that, the Nazis they were clearly our enemies in World War II, that current citizens are essentially equivalent to that. And in treason law, what can you do to an enemy? Well, you shoot them and kill them because you're actually in a state of war with them. And if you think that that's appropriate for, American citizens, I don't even know what to say. That's just so staggeringly off charts of anything of how America constitutional democracy works. We have opposing political parties. We have people, 330 million people with all kinds of different beliefs, political beliefs, religious beliefs, what have you. And we're all supposed to get along and get together. And that doesn't mean that the government declares that, some huge swath of the people, liberals, Democrats, or whoever, are enemies. That sort of thing just absolutely deteriorates what our democracy is supposed to be. And so it's profoundly disappointing. And it's really hard to think of any presidents who have used rhetoric like that persistently. You have some who've occasionally slipped here and there, but generally they have tried not to do that and have tried to be the president for all the people. And I think what is so profoundly upsetting here is you have a president who seems to be in it primarily entirely for himself. And then the extent is to help anybody is only his own supporters. And even our worst presidents through history have understood that they are the presidents of all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's unfortunate that it's actually pitted family members against family members. It is just that that philosophy of them versus us has tainted so many aspects of our society, and people are forgetting that we're all American and we all have the same goals in mind at the end of the line. And I think it's an artifice to take control, probably. That's the way I see it. I don't know if you see it that way.
Yeah, and we've had periods of polarization in the past, but if you think even say in the 1980s, you would have say Senators Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy come from very different political parties, have very different views. They would on the Senate floor absolutely rip each other to pieces, talking about how terrible the other's ideas were and how they were wrong for America and so forth. And then they go have dinner together because they're friends.
Mhm.
They disagree about their ideas, but they still understand that that person is still a person, and that there's a lot to like in that person. You can disagree, but still be friends. And that sort of, I think, across the aisle friendships have largely vanished from the United States Congress. They used to be very common now partly because members of Congress are home every weekend, but also just because of the relentless polarization. You don't see those sorts of things anymore. It becomes harder to find those moments when people really can work together and find some common ground. I mean, you're never going to reach the common ground if you're not talking to people, because if you're only talking to your own group, nothing's ever going to happen.
Now, what about the concept of treason and people who are not American citizens? Can you touch on that a little?
Yeah, sure. So if you are not an American citizen and you are in the United States, you are actually subject to our treason law and could be potentially convicted of the crime. And this is one of those things that is not very well understood. I mean, you see it even lots of books written by lawyers, constitutional law professors. They'll say things like, "Well, only citizens can commit treason," but that's actually not true. Treason is not a breach of citizenship; it's a breach of allegiance. And so, in order to be subject to a treason charge, you have to owe allegiance to the United States. So that happens in two ways. One, if you're a citizen, you have what's called permanent allegiance, and that means you are allegiant to the United States. Wherever you go in the world, you have to have your loyalty to the United States first. Now, if you're not a citizen, but you're present in the United States, then we have what's called temporary allegiance. And what that means is while you're in the United States, you are treated as if you were a citizen, and you have the same obligations as a citizen. But if you leave the United States, then it goes away. That's why we say it's temporary. So when you go back to another country, that loyalty is no longer there. So while in the United States, you are subject to our treason law in the same way as any citizen would be. And that's also true, of course, for US citizens in other countries, right? If we go to Germany while we're there, we'd be subject to German treason law. Pretty much every country has this sort of reciprocal notion of who is subject to the law, because obviously you don't want a situation where you have some people in the country who are just exempt from the criminal law for a particular reason. So you could have situations where non-citizens have committed treason against the United States. I think 9/11 might be an example of that. I think you could say that the non-citizens who flew a plane into the Pentagon, they were levying war against the United States, and they had a temporary allegiance while they were here. So had they survived, they could have been subject possibly to a treason charge.
And what about the marathon bombers in Boston? How were they? Well, there was one surviving person. I don't know how he was charged. I don't know if you recall.
Yeah, so there wasn't treason charge in that case. I mean, I don't think just sort of ordinary acts of terrorism, just setting off a bomb somewhere, is generally going to be an act of treason unless it's sort of directly against the United States. So in that case, I don't think the marathon would have counted. But that's one of those things where, sure, it's not technically treason, but it's clearly murder. And so it doesn't really matter in the sense that that person is going to go to jail or be executed for a truly horrific crime. There's hardly any circumstance I can think of where it's sort of the narrow definition we have of treason has actually resulted in anybody who is truly horrible escaping the punishment they deserve.
Now, part of treason is aid and comfort. What does that consist of?
So there have been a handful of cases on this issue. You generally have to provide some sort of material support, something that makes it easier for the enemy to accomplish their goals. And so that usually is not, for example, if you just posted something on the internet in support of the enemy and you did so without any coordination with the enemy. That would be your free speech right to make that statement. But if you provide money to the enemy, you provide, equipment, you provide training to the enemy, anything like that would be a form of aid and comfort.
Mhm. Now, Edward Snowden provided a lot of information, a lot of secret information. How, I know I read your book and you said that was not treason. Can you explain why not?
Yeah, so what Snowden did, I think, was really quite despicable. This was someone who betrayed a huge amount of government secrets. He claimed he had good reasons for doing that, but the volume of material that he revealed and the level of knowledge which he had in the US government, which was fairly low, suggests that he really had no idea what he was revealing or how harmful it could potentially be. So he was obviously subject to espionage laws and I think some other criminal laws as well. But it wouldn't technically be treason because he essentially provided it, I believe, on the internet to everybody. And so it wasn't provided to a foreign enemy. Now, if he had simply handed that file, say, over to Al Qaeda, maybe to the Taliban, then that probably would have been treason because he actually would be aiding the enemy by providing them with that sort of useful information. But just a general release to the whole world would not be treason.
Mhm. So intent here is important.
Well, it's partly intent, but it's also more who you gave it to. And so even though by giving it to the whole world, it did go to the Al Qaeda and the Taliban, presumably. But that wasn't that was sort of an indirect result of what he did. What he did provide it really to everyone.
Mhm. Now, there was a report that President Trump actually gave to somebody at Mar-a-Lago. I believe he was an Australian billionaire. Sensitive information about, I guess, nuclear submarines, US nuclear submarines. How does that fit into divulging secrets and things of that nature?
Yeah, so it certainly wouldn't be treason. Again, because Australia is not an enemy. So if you provide information to Australia, it's just not going to be treason. That would be subject to various laws governing classified information. I'm not an expert in that, but my understanding is, at least in some cases, the president has declassification authority. And so if the president chooses to share that information with someone, that may well be consistent with the law. It would depend, I think, on the particular documents, the particular statute that would
Mhm.
govern in that situation.
It just seems counterintuitive to me to be sharing nuclear secrets with someone from a foreign nation.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that intuition, but I think that there will be cases where we do share information with other nations. So, for example, Australia is part of what we call the Five Eyes group, which is Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where we essentially share our intelligence information
Oh,
openly
sure, but this guy
with
was a billionaire.
those. Yeah,
He was a billionaire. He wasn't part of government.
yeah, and so with individuals, that's obviously a much dicier uh,
I would
thing to
think
do.
so.
Although even then, you could imagine situations where you know, say for example, Elon Musk providing Starlink services to Ukraine, where a president might think it appropriate to bring in billionaires on even foreign billionaires on certain types of issues. But I think in general, that's probably a practice best avoided.
Mhm. Um, do you have any other closing comments on treason or any of these related topics that I may have omitted?
Um, no, I think it was just saying, in general, people often ask, is it treason? And the answer is almost always no, because it is very narrowly defined. And generally, we shouldn't be calling each other traitors, right? That it's just such a word that doesn't, advance political discourse. And so hopefully my book can sort of explain, where are those circumstances where, it truly is treason, understanding that in most cases it almost certainly is not.
Mhm. I'm just curious, what would you call someone if you didn't call them a traitor who exhibited those characteristics, but technically is not a traitor? Is there a word for
Yeah,
that?
no, that's a great question. And I've been asked that before, and I've thought about it a lot before, and there is no such word.
Mhm.
Um, so somebody suggested perhaps we could name it for Trump and call it Trumpery or something like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, we don't have the word that captures things that are sort of close to treason but aren't
Mhm.
aren't
Yeah.
technically.
And I don't think the legislature will broaden that terminology anytime soon. I don't believe.
No, but they've created a lot of different crimes that hopefully in many circumstances will do the job even if treason doesn't.
Mhm. Well, thank you. This has been quite enlightening. I appreciate your time. And again, I enjoyed reading your book, and I look forward to your next one on the Declaration of Independence.
Well, thank you. Very much enjoyed it.
I want to thank our guest, Professor Carlton Larson, for sharing his insights and opinions on treason and issues plaguing our democracy. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guest, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. As always, this information is for general educational purposes only. It is not to be construed as legal or personal advice. So please seek a qualified practitioner as to your own legal or personal needs. And don't forget, find us online and subscribe on Substack, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and now Blue Sky.